Her name was Eleanor Whitaker. She was 72 years old, and she had spent nearly her entire life in Savannah, Georgia, believing that reliability was the same thing as love. If she showed up early, stayed late, solved problems quietly, and never asked for recognition, she assumed her place in the family would remain unquestioned. It took one evening for her to understand how fragile that assumption had always been. The invitation arrived by text, not even a call. Her son Michael and his wife Lauren were hosting a celebration dinner at their newly renovated historic home near Forsyth Park. The message was cheerful, full of exclamation points, talking about catered seafood, a jazz trio, and important guests. It sounded grand, polished, carefully arranged. What it did not include was a simple sentence: "We want you there." Lauren phoned the next day, speaking quickly, excitement rushing through every word. She described the decor, the guest list, the private chef, the lighting on the back terrace. She never asked if Eleanor felt comfortable driving at night. She never asked if Eleanor had other plans. Eleanor told herself not to overthink it. She had learned over decades to smooth over small omissions. The evening of the event, Savannah air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of magnolias and river water. Eleanor parked 2 streets away because the driveway was full. Laughter floated out of the open windows. Soft jazz drifted across the courtyard. Through the iron gate, she could see men in linen jackets, women in silk dresses, glasses already raised in quiet celebration. Lauren met her at the door with a quick embrace that felt more logistical than affectionate. "You're here." "Perfect timing," she said, already glancing past Eleanor's shoulder. "We're running a little behind. Would you mind helping just for a moment?" Just for a moment. Eleanor followed her into the kitchen. Platters were lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. Champagne flutes stood empty. A typed checklist was taped to the refrigerator. Lauren handed her a serving cloth and said lightly, "You always know how to make things flow." It was phrased as praise. It was delivered as expectation. As guests continued to arrive, Eleanor moved between the kitchen and the terrace, refilling glasses, adjusting centerpieces, guiding the caterer when questions arose. She watched Lauren greet investors, neighbors, and colleagues with warmth that glowed. "This is my husband's partner. This is the architect who saved the renovation. This is our dear friend from Charleston." When someone unfamiliar glanced toward Eleanor and asked who she was, Lauren smiled pleasantly. "Oh, she's helping us tonight." "Helping?" Michael passed through once, phone pressed to his ear. He kissed Eleanor's cheek without slowing down. "Thanks for stepping in, Mom. We'll catch up later." Later stretched thin. Eventually, Eleanor glimpsed the dining room. A long oak table gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Place cards were arranged in careful script. She counted them without intending to. 9 settings. 9 names. She counted again. Her name was not among them. At first she assumed there must be an oversight. A last-minute change. An extra chair somewhere. She stepped closer, scanning each handwritten card. Investors. Business partners. Lauren's cousin from Atlanta. Even the jazz musician had a seat for dessert. There was no mistake. A slow, precise realization settled over her. She had not been invited as a guest. She had been scheduled as support. The dinner bell rang softly. Guests drifted toward the table. Eleanor was still holding a tray of roasted vegetables when Lauren approached again. "Could you set these out before we sit? It just looks smoother if everything's in place." Eleanor carried the platters in. Conversation dipped slightly as she entered, not out of interest but out of coordination, as if she were part of the choreography. She set the dishes down carefully and remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. There was still no chair. Lauren noticed the pause and gave a light laugh. "Oh, don't worry about sitting. We just need a little help while everyone gets settled." Michael was already seated. His napkin rested neatly in his lap. His wine had been poured. He did not look up. In that suspended second, something within Eleanor shifted from hope to clarity. Not anger. Not humiliation. Recognition. She reached to her wrist and unclasped a slim gold watch Michael had given her on her 70th birthday. At the time he had said, "For everything you've done for me." She had treasured it not for its value, but for the sentiment. She stepped toward him and placed it gently beside his plate. The faint click against porcelain seemed louder than the music outside. Michael looked up, confusion knitting his forehead. "Mom." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "You've made it very clear where I belong tonight." Lauren stiffened. "Eleanor, please, that's not what this is." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. "I won't interrupt your evening further," she said calmly. "Enjoy your celebration." There was a pause long enough for someone to offer her a seat, to rearrange the table, to speak her name with intention. No one did. She walked out through the courtyard, past the magnolias and lanterns, into the humid Georgia night. Behind her, conversation slowly resumed, as if her absence required only minor adjustment. She did not drive home. Instead, she crossed the Talmadge Bridge toward a small coastal inn outside the city. The river lights shimmered beneath her. The radio remained silent. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think without interruption. The inn room was simple, anonymous. She set her handbag on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the evening without emotion distorting it. It had not been one careless oversight. It had been structured, deliberate. She opened her phone and scrolled through recent emails. Monthly statements were missing. Notifications she usually received directly had stopped weeks earlier. One message caught her attention. "Your communication preferences have been updated." She had not updated anything. A chill of focus replaced any lingering sadness. Over the next hour, she traced small inconsistencies. A document she had been asked to sign for efficiency. A meeting she had been told was unnecessary for her to attend. Conversations that ended with, "We'll explain later." Later had never come. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lauren. "Are you coming back tonight, or should we lock up?"
No apology.
Only logistics. Eleanor turned the phone face down. This was not about hurt feelings. It was about positioning. About softening her presence until it could be redirected, managed, reduced. She retrieved a leather notebook from her bag, one she had used for decades while managing her late husband's construction firm. She began writing dates, names, requests, exact phrases. Patterns formed quickly. She had spent her life designing systems strong enough to survive storms. She understood leverage. She understood authority. She understood contingency clauses buried in contracts no one else read. What her family had mistaken for passivity was discipline. And discipline, once redirected, is formidable. She lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. She did not cry. She did not panic. She recalculated. The dinner had not been the beginning of the problem. It had been confirmation. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Whitaker understood that usefulness without boundaries becomes invisibility. The next move would not be emotional. It would be precise. Eleanor did not return to the historic house near Forsyth Park the next morning. She waited 2 full days. Not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. Reaction reveals vulnerability. Timing reveals strength. When she finally drove back, it was early afternoon, when Savannah sunlight is sharp and honest, when shadows hide less. She told herself she was going to collect a few personal documents and photographs, items she preferred to gather on her own rather than have boxed and handed back to her with polite detachment. Michael and Lauren were supposed to be out meeting with the contractor. Their schedules were predictable. Eleanor had once built them that way. The house was unlocked. That detail alone lingered in her mind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner, as though surfaces had been recently wiped down. The quiet felt curated. She moved slowly down the hallway, her steps measured on the old hardwood floors. The renovation had preserved the exterior charm, but inside everything was modern. Glass, chrome, smooth edges. Nothing personal remained in the common spaces except carefully chosen art. As she approached Michael's home office, she heard Lauren's voice.
Low.
Controlled. Not the bright social tone she used for guests. Eleanor stopped instinctively. The office door was not fully closed. A narrow slice of space carried sound clearly. No, she doesn't realize how much authority she still has, Lauren was saying. That's exactly the issue. There was a pause while the person on the other end responded.
Yes.
We need to move carefully. If we frame it as concern, people will understand. She left the dinner abruptly. That helps. It suggests instability. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. Assisted living is the cleanest solution, Lauren continued. Once that's in place, consolidation becomes simple. Accounts, signatures, operational control, it all transfers naturally. Another pause. Of course, Michael feels guilty. But he understands this is about the future. We can't keep building with her name attached to everything. It complicates investors. A soft laugh followed.
Light.
Almost amused. She's been useful, Lauren said. But usefulness isn't ownership. And we need ownership now. The hallway felt suddenly narrower. Eleanor did not gasp. She did not move abruptly. She stepped backward slowly, each motion deliberate, until she was out of range of sight. Her pulse remained steady. Shock would have been a luxury. Instead, she catalogued words: authority, instability, assisted living, consolidation, ownership. Michael knew. That was the part that pressed hardest against her composure. Not Lauren's calculation. Lauren had always been strategic. It was Michael's consent, his quiet agreement. Eleanor exited the house without retrieving a single document. In her car, she closed the door gently and sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel. Savannah traffic moved past in its usual rhythm. Nothing in the world looked different. But structure had shifted. They were not reacting to her age. They were reacting to her control. For decades, Eleanor had overseen the financial framework behind her late husband's construction company. After his death, she had maintained operational authority quietly, ensuring contracts were fulfilled and investments managed wisely. Michael had entered the business with vision and ambition, but much of the capital, much of the stability, still rested in systems she had designed. She had assumed collaboration. They had interpreted dependency. She drove directly to a law office downtown near Chippewa Square. The brass plaque beside the door read, Harrison and Cole, attorneys at law. Inside worked a man she trusted more than most, David Cole. Years earlier, when zoning regulations threatened one of her largest projects, David had navigated the legal maze with precision. He respected clarity. He respected preparation. He looked up from his desk when she entered, surprise flickering across his features before settling into recognition. Mrs. Whitaker, he said carefully. I wondered if I might see you soon. I believe you might, she replied. She did not dramatize the dinner. She did not emphasize emotion. She laid out facts chronologically. The altered communication settings, the missing notifications, the unexplained documents, the overheard conversation.
Dates. Exakt frasen.
Observations without embellishment. David listened without interruption, hands folded, eyes steady. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. They're building a narrative, he said. One where your independence appears compromised. If that narrative gains legal traction, they could petition for guardianship. The word landed with quiet force. Can they? she asked.
Not easily, he replied.
Not if you act first. That was all she needed. Over the next several hours, they reviewed every document tied to her name, property holdings, business shares, trust arrangements that had remained dormant but intact. Eleanor had never relinquished full authority. She had merely allowed shared access for convenience. Convenience is exploitable. David drafted amendments restoring sole notification rights on all primary accounts. Dual signature requirements were removed where unnecessary. A revocable trust was restructured to ensure that operational control remained exclusively hers unless she chose otherwise in writing before witnesses unrelated to family. Discretion is essential, David said. If they realize what's happening too early, they may accelerate their efforts. Eleanor nodded. She understood strategy. There was one more element she insisted upon. A separate educational trust for her granddaughter, Lily, fully funded, inaccessible to either parent, protected from redirection under any circumstance, unrelated to Lily's direct benefit. That remains untouched, Eleanor said firmly. No matter what happens between adults. David agreed. By the time she left the office, Savannah's late afternoon sun had softened into gold. Tourists moved lazily along the squares. Horse-drawn carriages clattered across cobblestone streets. The city appeared unchanged. But beneath the surface, control had already shifted. 2 days later, Michael began calling repeatedly. Eleanor allowed the calls to go unanswered until David confirmed that all structural adjustments were complete. Access permissions had been reconfigured. Advisory notifications restored solely to her devices. Legal safeguards activated. When Michael finally requested an in-person meeting, she agreed. They met not at the historic house, but at David's office. Michael arrived first, pacing. Lauren followed, composed but tense. They both exhaled slightly when Eleanor entered, as if her presence meant explanation rather than consequence. They were mistaken. David outlined the changes calmly. Asset control reassigned. Authority clarified. Transfer restrictions formalized. Lauren's expression tightened. This must be temporary, she said. We were only trying to streamline operations. Eleanor looked at her evenly. Streamlining does not require erasing. Michael's voice rose. Why didn't you talk to us? She held his gaze. I tried for years. You preferred convenience. David slid the updated documents across the table. Mrs. Whitaker retains full control of all primary holdings. No transfers may occur without her explicit written consent under independent legal review. Silence thickened. Lauren leaned forward. You're overreacting. This is because of that dinner. Eleanor's voice remained steady. The dinner clarified things. It did not cause them. Michael looked suddenly uncertain, not about money, but about alignment. He understood now that the framework supporting his ambitions had not vanished. It had simply returned to its architect. You're taking everything away, he said quietly.
No, Eleanor replied.
I'm removing what was never yours to assume. No one raised their voice again. When the meeting concluded, Michael hesitated at the door, as though searching for language that might reverse time. But accountability offers no shortcuts. After they left, Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer. This was not revenge. Revenge is loud. This was recalibration. For the first time in months, she felt not invisible, but anchored. They had mistaken her restraint for fragility. Now, they would have to confront the difference. The first visible crack did not appear in a courtroom or at a family dinner table. It appeared in Michael's voice. 3 days after the meeting at David's office, he called again. This time Eleanor answered. He did not begin with anger. He began with confusion. Mom, investors are asking questions. They're saying approvals are delayed. Why are things being routed differently?
Because they always should have been, she thought.
Aloud, she said, Because clarity prevents misunderstanding. He exhaled slowly. It feels like you don't trust us. Eleanor stood by the window of her small apartment overlooking a quiet Savannah street. Spanish moss shifted in the breeze, indifferent to human tension. Trust, she replied evenly, requires transparency. There was a pause long enough for honesty to enter the space. We were trying to protect the company, he said. From me? She asked gently. He didn't answer. That silence confirmed more than any argument could. The restructuring unfolded quietly but thoroughly. Contracts that once passed automatically through shared access now required Eleanor's direct review. Notifications that had been rerouted returned to her private email. Financial summaries once filtered through layers of simplification now arrived unedited. What she saw was not fraud. It was ambition untethered from caution. Michael and Lauren had expanded aggressively, new property acquisitions, short-term leveraged loans, marketing expenditures that assumed constant growth. None of it was reckless in isolation, but it depended on one invisible stabilizer: her long-standing reserves and credit reliability. They had treated her foundation as permanent background noise. Now that background required consent. Eleanor did not sabotage. She did not block reasonable proposals. She evaluated each decision with the same discipline she had used for 40 years. Some she approved, others she revised. A few she declined outright, explaining why in concise written notes. Pushback came quickly. Lauren requested a private conversation at a cafe near River Street. Eleanor agreed. Lauren arrived composed, but her posture held tension. This back and forth makes us look unstable, she said. You used to trust our judgment. I used to be included in it, Eleanor replied. Lauren's jaw tightened. We were only trying to move forward, and you believed I was in the way. Lauren didn't deny it. You've built your life on control, Lauren continued carefully. Maybe it's hard to let go. Eleanor almost smiled. Letting go and being erased are not the same thing. The cafe noise swelled briefly between them, espresso machines hissing, tourists laughing outside. You left that dinner dramatically, Lauren said. It worried people.
No, Eleanor answered calmly.
It inconvenienced you. Lauren's composure slipped for a fraction of a second. You could have just spoken to us, she said. I did, Eleanor replied. You simply preferred I remain useful. Lauren leaned back, studying her differently now, not as background support, but as an equal across the table. For the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty in her. Weeks passed. The house near Forsyth Park went up for sale, as previously structured under Eleanor's revised trust. That decision had been embedded in contingency clauses years earlier, activated automatically once operational leadership shifted, without unanimous consent. Michael hadn't realized that clause existed. When he confronted her about it, his frustration was raw. You're dismantling everything we worked for. Eleanor met him at the property one last time before showings began. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto polished floors. No, she said quietly.
I'm preventing collapse.
He looked around the empty living room. This was supposed to be ours. It still can be, she replied. Just not funded by assumptions. He stared at her, conflict clear in his expression. Why didn't you ever tell me how much of this depended on you? He asked. Because I believed you were watching. The truth of that settled heavily. Behind the scenes, Eleanor continued fortifying structure. She met with independent auditors to ensure no documentation could be misinterpreted. She updated her medical directives and power of attorney designations, assigning them not to Michael, but to a neutral fiduciary. Not out of punishment, out of prudence. If they attempted a guardianship narrative, it would meet documented competence, financial literacy, and legal clarity. Preparation is quiet power. One evening, her granddaughter Lily visited alone. She was 16 now, perceptive beyond her years. "Dad's stressed," Lily admitted as they walked through Forsyth Park. "He says everything feels unstable." Eleanor did not criticize her son. "Growth often feels unstable," she said gently. Lily hesitated. "Did you really plan all this?" "I plan to protect what I built," Eleanor answered. They sat on a shaded bench. Spanish moss swayed overhead. "Dad said you don't trust him," Lily added. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter carefully. "Trust isn't about affection. It's about accountability." Lily absorbed that quietly. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked finally. Eleanor reached into her handbag and handed her an envelope, not containing numbers, but a simple letter explaining the educational trust established solely in Lily's name. "You," Eleanor said softly, "are already okay." Lily read silently, eyes widening slightly. "Dad doesn't know about this." "He doesn't need to." For the first time, Eleanor felt the generational shift stabilize, not through control, but through protection without leverage. Months passed. The property sold at fair value. Michael downsized operations, reluctantly at first, then strategically. Without immediate access to Eleanor's full backing, he was forced to confront real risk assessments. Some projects were postponed, others restructured. To Eleanor's quiet observation, he began asking questions he had never asked before. What's the worst-case scenario? What reserve percentage is actually safe? Where did you learn to negotiate like that? She answered when asked sincerely. Respect, she noticed, entered through difficulty, not entitlement. The most significant shift came unexpectedly. At a quarterly review meeting, now attended by Eleanor as equal principal, an investor questioned the tightened governance. "It seems overly cautious," the man remarked. "Why centralize authority like this?" Before Eleanor could respond, Michael spoke. "It's not centralized," he said steadily. "It's clarified. We expanded faster than we should have. My mother built the foundation we rely on. We're adjusting to ensure sustainability." The acknowledgement was brief, but it was real. Eleanor did not react outwardly. Internally, she registered the shift. Ownership of mistake is the beginning of maturity. Later that evening, Michael walked her to her car. "I didn't understand," he admitted quietly. "I thought because you didn't demand recognition, it didn't matter." "It mattered," she said. "I simply chose silence. And now I choose boundaries." He nodded slowly. "I was afraid," he added, "of not proving myself, of always standing in your shadow." Eleanor studied him. For years she had minimized her strength to make space for his confidence. "I never wanted you small," she said gently. "I wanted you steady." The difference, she realized, had never been explained. By the end of that year, operations were leaner but stronger. Decision-making was collaborative rather than assumptive. Notifications remained transparent. Legal safeguards stayed in place. Eleanor did not restore shared access. Trust, once recalibrated, requires new terms. Her life outside the business deepened as well. She volunteered teaching financial literacy workshops for widowed and divorced women in Savannah, women who had quietly signed documents they did not fully understand, women who mistook usefulness for security. She told them no personal details, but she taught them how to read clauses, how to verify authority, how to protect dignity without confrontation. One evening, standing alone near the riverfront, Eleanor watched cargo ships move slowly through the harbor. Savannah hummed with tourist chatter and distant music. She felt no triumph, only steadiness. The dinner months ago had not destroyed her place in the family. It had revealed it. And revelation, when met with discipline rather than emotion, becomes transformation. Michael and Lauren had believed they were securing control. Instead, they had triggered correction. The difference between dominance and leadership had become visible. And Eleanor Whitaker no longer mistook silence for safety. She had reclaimed not only authority, but authorship. 1 year later, the house near Forsyth Park belonged to another family. The renovation photos still floated online somewhere, polished and carefully filtered, but the story attached to them had shifted. Michael and Lauren now operated from a smaller office closer to the industrial district by the Savannah River. The business remained alive, leaner, less theatrical, more deliberate. And Eleanor lived somewhere entirely different. She had moved into a modest two-bedroom cottage on a quiet street lined with crepe myrtles. It wasn't grand. The kitchen cabinets didn't match perfectly. The porch steps creaked in humid weather. But every item inside had been chosen without negotiation. Every room reflected function, not performance. For the first time in decades, her schedule did not revolve around filling someone else's gaps. Her mornings began early. She walked through nearby squares while the city was still soft with dawn light. Afterward, she volunteered at a community resource center teaching financial literacy workshops for older women, widows, retirees, women navigating divorce after 30 or 40 years of shared accounts they had never truly overseen. She never told them her full story.
She didn't need to.
Instead, she asked questions. Do you know whose name is on your primary account? Have you read the authorization clause you signed? If your notification stopped tomorrow, would you notice? At first, the women answered with uncertainty. By the end of each course, they answered with clarity. Eleanor did not teach them fear. She taught them structure. Because fear reacts. Structure endures. Michael's calls had grown less frantic over time. They became measured, practical, occasionally reflective. One afternoon, he invited her to tour the new office. There was no grand unveiling this time.
No catertras.
No jazz trio. Just spreadsheets, floor plans, and a whiteboard filled with risk projections. He walked her through the revised operating model, explaining reserve buffers and phased expansions. He used terms she had once explained to him years ago. I finally understand what you meant about stability being invisible, he said quietly. She listened without interrupting. I thought growth proved competence, he continued. But sustainability proves it better. Eleanor nodded once. Ambition is useful, she said. But without discipline, it becomes dependency. He absorbed that without defensiveness. There was still distance between them. Respect had returned before warmth. But respect is sturdier. Lauren's shift had been subtler. Where once she projected certainty, now she asked more questions in meetings. She no longer spoke of simplifying by reducing oversight. She spoke of alignment. One evening, months after the legal restructuring, Lauren asked to meet Eleanor privately. They sat on Eleanor's porch as cicadas hummed in the humid air. I miscalculated you, Lauren admitted plainly. Eleanor appreciated the absence of excuses. I assumed that because you didn't assert control publicly, you didn't value it, Lauren continued. I thought I was protecting our future. By removing me from it, Eleanor replied. Lauren didn't look away. Yes. Silence stretched between them, not hostile, but honest. I grew up watching my mother lose everything because she trusted the wrong signatures, Lauren said quietly. Control feels like safety to me. Eleanor studied her more closely then. Control without consent isn't safety, she said. It's fear wearing structure. Lauren exhaled slowly. I see that now. Trust would not reset overnight. But acknowledgement matters. Christmas approached with less spectacle than the year before. This time, Eleanor hosted dinner in her small cottage. There were no investors, no elaborate place cards, just her daughter Caroline visiting from Charleston with her family, Michael and Lauren arriving together, and Lily carrying a pie she had baked herself. The table was modest, but intentional. Every chair was visible. Eleanor set them herself, counting not out of suspicion, but out of awareness. When everyone sat down, there was no choreography, Only conversation. The food wasn't catered. It was imperfect and warm. Someone spilled cider and laughed. Midway through dinner, Lily looked around and said softly, "This feels different."
How?
Michael asked. "Quieter," she replied, "but better." Eleanor caught Michael's glance across the table. This time, he didn't look away. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and guests lingered over coffee, Michael stepped onto the porch with her. "I was angry at you," he admitted. "For months." "I know," she said calmly. "I thought you were punishing us." "I wasn't." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." They stood in silence, watching passing headlights reflect briefly on the street. "I didn't realize how much you carried," he said. "You made everything look easy." "That was my mistake," Eleanor replied. "I mistook invisibility for strength." He considered that. "I don't want you invisible," he said finally. She met his gaze steadily. "Then don't treat me that way." It wasn't sharp. It was simple. And simplicity leaves little room for confusion. The educational trust for Lily remained untouched and undisclosed beyond Eleanor and her attorney. It wasn't leverage. It was insulation. Because protecting the next generation should never depend on the maturity of the current one. Eleanor's medical directives remained assigned to a neutral fiduciary. Her financial notifications remained exclusively hers. Safeguards stayed intact, not as weapons, but as boundaries. Boundaries are not punishments. They are definitions. As the year closed, Eleanor reflected not on the dinner that had begun everything, but on the transformation that followed. She had not lost her family. She had lost an illusion. She once believed being needed guaranteed belonging. She once believed silence preserved harmony. She once believed patience would naturally be reciprocated with respect. Now she understood something deeper. Belonging requires acknowledgement. Harmony requires clarity. Respect requires structure. One evening in early spring, Eleanor walked along the Savannah River at sunset. Cargo ships moved slowly across the horizon. Tourists snapped photos. Street musicians played softly nearby. The city remained indifferent to personal reckonings. But she was no longer seeking validation from indifference. Her life felt smaller in scale and larger in integrity. She was not the quiet backbone anymore. She was the architect who chose when and where to build. Months later, Michael invited her to a modest anniversary gathering at a local restaurant overlooking the water. This time, when she arrived, a host greeted her by name. "There's a seat reserved for you, Mrs. Whitaker." She stepped inside calmly. The table was smaller than the one in the grand house a year earlier. The lighting softer, the guest list shorter. But when she approached, Michael stood immediately. He pulled out a chair, not performatively, not dramatically, simply because it was hers. Lauren met her eyes without defensiveness. Lily smiled. Eleanor sat down, not because she needed permission, but because she chose to. There are moments when walking away looks like loss to those watching from the outside. But sometimes leaving is how you reset the foundation beneath everything. Eleanor was never punished for being useful. She was nearly erased for being quiet. The moment she stopped allowing that, the entire structure shifted. Family does not grant automatic authority over your dignity. Love does not require strategic silence. And self-respect, once reclaimed, does not ask for applause. It simply takes its seat at the table it helped build. And this time, the chair remains exactly where she placed it.